developing a small-scale economy. This in turn encouraging...
Heybridge opened 10 years ago, the creation of Mrs. Helen Fooks, as a memorial to her husband, Major Herbert Fooks, who was a pioneer in the techniques of deer management in this country and abroad. The warden today at Heybridge is John Corfield, and it was he who explained to me how the reserve works.
This area is really set aside to protect all forms of wildlife. We're particularly keen about the deer of this area, though, because some of the finest red deer in Britain live here in the Furness Fells. And they are subject to various pressures throughout this area. So it was felt that it would be a good thing to have an area like this designated as sanctuary, where they could at least live for a part of their lives, or a part of the year of their lives, devoid of any pressures.
But how do they come here then?
Well, they're quite free to come and go. As nomadic wanderers, the red deer can be with us 1 week, and they can move on and go back up onto the heights beyond to Grisdale the following week.
But if they're free to roam into your 200-odd acres, how do you prevent those public pressures from coming in as well?
Well, we ask in our publicity that people should call up first before they make a visit here. As you've seen, the road into the reserve, in fact, ends here at the museum. And so, as it's a quiet little side road, people don't find it all that easily, and people who wish to come, having heard about the place, are asked if they would please call up so that they don't come in hordes.
And what about people with malicious intent?
Well, we take care of them. We've got a very good system here, which early warning system, you might say, with all our neighbouring farmers, so that anybody with any malicious intent very quickly gets recognised. And of course, with the tremendous cooperation we get from our local police, we don't have many problems. Inevitably, in a place like this, people bring animals and birds and wild creatures in, having found them or found them in some kind of distress. When I say found them, we always emphasize to children that very few creatures ever abandon their young. So in fact, you rarely find an animal because it isn't lost. So we emphasize that whenever you come across a creature, whether it be bird or mammal, never assume that it's been abandoned, and never assume that it's there for you to rescue.
Well, what should you do? I mean, if I found a fawn in the middle of the road, what should I do about it?
Well, if you found it in the middle of the road, the only thing you could do, really, would be to pick it up and put it on the side, well inside the woodland, on the edge of the road. We often get this one, in fact. One of the animals we have here now was found in the middle of a road, and apparently hadn't been born very long. Its umbilical cord was still wet. So the young lady who found it, or who picked it up, assumed that it was in distress and had been abandoned and took it home, and subsequently brought it here. Once an animal has been brought in here, of course it has to be fed. And that contact with humans means that the animal loses its natural fear of humans. And then the danger is, as it grows up, and of course you have to keep it for well within its first year anyway, to make sure it does survive. And then, having lost its fear of humans, to try to return it to the wild could cause problems with the males of the species, because they become aggressive in their second and third year of their lives and may well attack somebody.
So your foundling is then more or less, condemns too strong a word, but certainly he's going to have to live here for the rest of his life.
It's destined to stay with us for the rest of its life,
So how, John, do you feed the deer that live here as distinct from the wild ones who just wander in occasionally?
Well, they're fed artificially, of course, with cattle food. The same food, in fact, that farmers use for their milk cows during winter when they're indoors. But it's supplemented by holly and ivy, too.
Really?
I collect holly and ivy from all the surrounding lanes, and of course they have to have greenery in addition to the concentrates. It's better, in fact, for them to pick the food up off the floor, which is, of course, a much more natural thing for them to do anyway, rather than feed them in troughs, which means that they can really eat their food from a trough much more quickly, rather than a more natural slower way by picking it up off the ground as they would normally do. The overgrazing by sheep has in some cases reduced the natural food that is available or was available to the animals, but we can never blame sheep entirely. The demands on the woodlands over the last 1,000 years or so, from the time of the monks of Furness Abbey with their sheep interests, has meant that gradually the natural woodlands of northern Britain have been in decline and are now being replaced by the coniferous plantations.
It's also, is it not, the rutting season for the red deer. Now, if you've got adult hinds here living tamely, do you have to act as a sort of marriage broker for the bucks up on the hills?
Not really, no. It sorts itself out. In fact, the hinds, when they come into season at this time of the year, transmit this message to the wild stags, who very quickly pick it up through scent, of course, and they turn up here regularly every year. So there are no problems as far as next year's calves are concerned.
How wild, in fact, are they allowed to be? Because you were mentioning earlier on about the pressures on them in this district, which is why you exist. I mean, can we go into some more detail about that? What sort of pressures?
Well, first of all, they're totally wild. The animals that we have in this area are free to roam wherever they will. But inevitably, they do cause problems, both within the forests and woodlands, through overgrazing, and even on farmland too, so that farmers don't always enjoy the sight of 30 or 40 stags eating the best grass in May. In addition to that, so the pressure is put on them to, move off. In addition to that, though, as a tourist area, which attracts millions of people to the Lake District every year, a large proportion of them do enjoy walking the fells and throughout the woodlands, and a proportion of that proportion have dogs with them.
And how
so the domestic dogs, of course, running away from their owners, enjoying themselves as they think, can very quickly pick up the scent of a wild animal and pursue it, which can cause great distress. Here we have a herd that's really quite vulnerable because the poachers can come into the Lake District and with its complex road systems can shoot an animal from the roadside at night, having blinded it with a spotlight, and can be away very quickly. So although we have a very good system of reporting and recording, like all systems, it's not 100%. There are problems in trying to pursue poachers around the roads.
So, well, I don't see you deterring poaching. What else you said suggests that the educational role here becomes more and more important.
Yes, education, of course, is the basis of all our long-term solutions. I think our main role here, apart from protecting the wildlife and maintaining this place devoid of pressures, is in fact to try to teach children.
What other things do you offer them besides deer?
Well, when they first come here, they're introduced to the area from the viewpoint up the hill, which gives them a lovely panorama of this valley. So having given them an introduction, we then go into more detail about specific species and the problems. We talk about the different habitats and the species that dwell within those different habitats.
Something else occurs to me too, that you've got a very busy, very active role here. How is it all financed?
When Mrs. Fooks first set the place up 10 years ago, it was largely her money that did it. It was her idea, her whole concept, and so she did all the initial financing. Since then, we formed a society, and society subscriptions pay the bulk of the expenses, but we're also lucky in that we have a grant from Lancashire Education Authority. Now, they came here in 1971 when we first opened and liked the idea of their children, especially the ones from towns and cities in the industrial areas, coming to the countryside to be taught about conservation in a place that's kept very quiet.
As John Corfield said, Haybridge is open to the public, but only by appointment. It's an absolutely fascinating place, well worth a visit, but please, don't wander in unannounced. And that's it for this week. Until our next program.